Welcome back. You're still watching Beautiful Day. This is Weather HQ. Now, as millions of Filipinos continue to pick up the pieces after climate disasters, the very companies most responsible in the oil, coal, and gas industry continue to profit. Now, as global talks on climate loss and damage open in Cebu, Greenpeace Philippines is urging leaders to demand accountability and push for real climate justice. Joining us live via Zoom this morning is Jefferson Chua, climate campaigner from Greenpeace Philippines, to talk about why the time has come to make climate polluters pay. Good morning, Jeff. Thank you so much for joining us here on Beautiful Day.
Good morning, and good morning to all your viewers.
All right, Jeff, let's start off first with the fact that developing countries are losing around $400 billion a year from climate disasters. But then the global pledges only cover 0.2% of that, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of the numbers. Let's talk about how this tiny amount may not be enough to really impact countries like us here in the Philippines, who are really in the path of the adverse effects of climate change.
It's not a surprise that the minuscule amount contributed by developed countries pales in comparison to the needs of especially frontline communities. No? And it's not just the fact that the fund is so small. It's also the fact that climate impacts are escalating. So we are expecting more costs down the line. No? So, and it's not just here in the Philippines, it's really around the world where different areas who haven't experienced climate impacts are now experiencing them at an escalated rate. Here in the Philippines, we're unfortunately, we're pretty used to big climate impacts. No? But the reality is that a lot of the communities here in the Philippines are also pushed the limit, and that means funds used to recover from these climate impacts are also pushed the limit. For example, last year, in the string of 6 typhoons we had in November, the calamity fund for the Philippines really whittled down. And that is really a foretaste of how costs will go up and how governments will be challenged beyond their limit to cope with these escalating climate impacts.
Of course, when we talk about the climate impact here in the country, there are also people saying that the Philippines is also responsible for a bit of the pollution that does affect the climate change. Does the Philippines actually contribute to a lot of the climate damage? How much of the percentage of the climate damage can be attributed to the Philippines in particular?
The reality is that the Philippines is one of the least contributors of carbon emissions historically. You have to look at the accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere as a historical thing. And that means that the most developed countries around the world have benefited with their development at the expense of increased carbon levels in the atmosphere, and which leads to increased climate impacts also on the ground. So if we look at it this way, the Philippines does contribute just a little amount to the carbon levels in the atmosphere, which is why there is that injustice element. Why do countries like the Philippines, who contribute so little to carbon emissions, suffer the most when it comes to climate impacts? Which is why this fund is really important for developing countries to have a fighting chance amidst escalating climate impacts.
And of course, you mentioned the word injustice. Again, is this, in your mind, the biggest injustice in terms of the climate conversation, that the countries that are more responsible, at least percentage-wise, to climate change all over the world are not really contributing as much as they should to areas that are more impacted by these climate disasters?
One of the things that a lot of people don't see is that the discussions on loss and damage aren't new. They have been here for decades. In fact, as early as 2007, the most vulnerable countries in the Pacific Islands actually already broached the idea that, hey, why shouldn't we have a fund to respond to loss and damage? And this dragged on for years, right? Because developed countries didn't want to face the music when it comes to their responsibility to climate impacts. And it's also because it's money. We don't see developed countries taking responsibility for the damages that climate impacts incur. And fortunately, after how many years, it was finally operationalized. But again, as you said a while ago, only 0.2% of the fund has been filled up, and this is also because of the continued refusal of different developed countries who have fossil fuel interests, right? To contribute less, no? Because contributing tantamount, no? To an acceptance of that responsibility, and we know now that because the fund is this low, countries still refuse, right? The biggest polluters still refuse to acknowledge the responsibility to helping out the most uh, at-risk nations to climate impacts.
You mentioned it a while ago. This requires international action. Now, for that to happen, the local government, or just the Philippine government, has to be able to actually push for that and to try and hold more of the major polluters accountable. How can the government do that? What are the avenues that you see as Greenpeace for the government to try and pursue to try and address yung climate issues po natin, especially when it comes to the major polluters, especially those who are in certain industries? You mentioned fossil fuel and oil a while ago as well.
Well, one is the fact that we are the host country for the fund responding to loss and damage. So we are in a prime position to call for payment for loss and damage from big polluters. And we're not just talking about countries, right? We're also talking about the companies behind the increased amounts of carbon emissions in the atmosphere, right? And nationally, right? The one of the ways that Philippines can lead the way is to show through its national policies that it is willing to make polluters pay and demand payment for loss and damage. And one of the key pieces of legislation that we have been lobbying for in Congress is the Climate Accountability Bill. This is a bill that was proposed back in November 2023 by the Committee on Climate Change Chair, Congressman Chato, and we have been really pushing and advocating for this piece of policy. Basically it is a polluters pay policy, right? Where the government collects revenue, right, from the biggest polluters and pulls that into a fund where communities can access directly for their recovery costs, right? For the costs incurred for climate impact. So we see that it is possible to create policy frameworks when it comes to polluters pay, and it's not just here in the Philippines. We also see other countries doing exactly the same. For example, in California, in the state of California in the USA, they are pushing for what they call a climate super fund, which gets revenues as well for emissions from big oil and gas companies to fund recovery costs for loss and damage. So it's not just exactly the Philippines that's doing this, it's also other countries. So it's really high time that different countries around the world pursue national legislation to make polluters pay.
Jeff, how have countries, corporations avoided taking responsibility in your mind when it comes to being able to be accountable for their percentage of the climate change and the disasters that it does entail?
Since the 1950s, companies such as BP, such as Shell, have already known, right? We have seen studies after studies from 50s, 60s, and 70s where their own scientists have sounded the alarm for the possibility of runaway climate change because of increased emissions and because of increased extraction. Now, we see that a lot of these companies, while they're expanding, are also continually denying their responsibility to climate change. In fact, one of the things that we fail to realize on an everyday basis is that even the idea of individual carbon footprint was essentially a marketing tool, to pass responsibility to individual consumers and drive away the gaze, right, to these big companies and their responsibility. So in terms of the responsibility, not just the emissions that they cause, but also the pattern of denial from the big companies that still perpetuate the climate crisis.
Jeff, of course, we now have to ask you, how can Filipinos find out more about your advocacy and join your call to make the climate polluters pay? What are the avenues for them to try and be part of your advocacy?
There is a big push for globally called the Polluters Pay Pact. We are pushing for different governments around the world to make polluters pay, and the voice must come right from frontline people, from people at the front lines of the climate crisis, concerned citizens, government people, and even ordinary citizens who are impacted in many ways by the climate crisis. We don't see it as much, but we also see the rising food prices as also a consequence, right, of a lot of these climate impacts. So it's really high time that we realize that it's not just the burden of taxpayers' money and government money that needs to be used to be able to recover from climate impacts, but really, right, the astronomical profits of big oil and gas companies who must give their fair share to respond to escalating climate impacts. So this is a global petition. We have launched this already, and this is available in our websites to be able to be part of this. And we will be bringing these demands. Right now, we already have 182,000 signatures, and we are really hoping to push for huge changes and reforms, even in multilateral and international spaces, to really make polluters pay.
He is climate campaigner for Greenpeace Philippines, Jefferson Chua. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jeff.
Thank you.